I'm Nathan Cragen. I run a little Instagram group called Brick Squadron, and I've designed all these 180 scale aircraft. I've been into Lego since I was a kid. My brothers and we always built growing up, but I always had a particular affinity for aviation because my dad, he was a pilot in the Air Force, and I've had the opportunity to follow in his footsteps. So in particular, the Utah Air Guard is what got me into aviation. My dad flew KC-135, so this big guy right here for, I'm going to throw a number out there, 26 years. I can't remember the exact number of years, but I've always been fascinated by aviation. I've always wanted to do something just like him, and because of that, as a kid, I would build a lot of Lego airplanes. And getting into COVID, I was away from my family, and I got really bored, discovered Studio on Bricklink, and I didn't have any of my actual Legos with me, so I just started building things digitally, and that's what culminated into getting into scale mocks of aviation.
So take us through, you mentioned one of the models here. What else do we have in this section?
Yeah, so this entire group right here is the history of the Utah Air Guard. My dad flew in the Air Guard for a majority of his career. My brother's in the Air Guard, I'm in the Air Guard, and so why not translate where I work, where I grew up, into Lego form? And so what we have here is the history through the aircraft. So you can see we have the F-51 Mustang, which is what started out in the Utah Air Guard, going on through the F-86 to the C-97, C-124, and then they got their air refueling mission, which is reflected with this KC-97 refueling this F-100, as well as the KC-135, which is kind of the centerpiece of it all, considering that's what the Air Guard currently flies. That's what I currently fly. So it's like there's that sentimental piece to it. And I went through and I created custom stickers based on an actual aircraft within the Utah Air Guard. So in this photo, that KC-97 is this exact KC-97 here. So the exact same tail number. That's the same thing with the C-124 in this photo. And in particular, this KC-135, this one's actually kind of sentimental. This is 0275. This is an aircraft that's still flown by the Air Guard today. When I was a young man, like 14 years old, my dad took our scout group on an incentive flight, and it was on 0275. Fast forward a decade later, when I became a pilot and I came back, the first flight on a Utah KC-135 was on 0275. So I would be amiss not to represent that particular aircraft in Lego form. But not just here. I love aviation history in general. So I did the Century series of Air Force aircraft, which is the F-100 through F-106 series of aircraft, which came out around the 50s and endured all the way up and through the 80s. They were used in various capacities. And I did custom stickers based on actual aircraft that carried those tail numbers. I did various other World War II models, like Army Air Force aircraft, Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, Navy carrier-based aircraft, including their folding wings. I'm actually going to go through and redesign a lot of these because as you progress building Lego, you learn new techniques and you streamline that. So a lot of the stuff that I have here up front are my more recent designs that take advantage of newer techniques that I've learned, while the stuff towards the back are my older designs, including my first mock, which is this T6 Texan 2 aircraft.
You can see how far you've come since then.
Going from literally bricks to using more snot techniques, a lot more curves, a lot more authentic appearances of the aircraft.
So take us through your design process if you can then. When you start with airplane models like the Utah Air Guard ones that you have here, you mentioned doing some digital building. Are there any sketches at all, or you just sit down with the bricks? How does that typically work?
So it started out, like I said, just purely digital. And going through that kind of translated to just the way I build now. Is I always start out digital, and I build the entire model digitally, and then do a physical build to see how it holds up. And so what I'll do is I'll pick an aircraft, I'll figure out the dimensions I'm looking for a 180 scale, which I build 180, and that's just kind of a happy accident. My first model I just built, and then I wanted to build matching aircraft with it, and so then I measured it, and I'm like, oh, this is roughly 180, and then it just kind of took off from there. So I measure it down to 180 scale, and then within Studio, I kind of build a frame of plates. Like, this is the dimensions I'm looking for the wingspan and the length, and then I just start building. And then as it starts taking up shape, I'll do renders, and I'll compare that up against the actual schematics of the real aircraft, and then making kind of adjustments from there. And it has evolved in the way that I've built. It used to be purely digital. Now it's kind of a mix of both, because there's certain things you can't reflect digitally. Like with particular my F-100, the wing slope is very difficult. And in digital form, it was really hard to kind of come up with the design. But once I kind of took it down physically, I came up with the ball joints and using that as the wing slope. But with Studio and its constraints of having collisions and stuff like that, I probably wouldn't have ever come up with that had I not actually sat down and physically built it and experimented that way. So there's definitely pros and cons to designing digitally. The pro being you don't actually have to physically have the parts to build it. The con, you're not able to sit there, play with it, feel it, and understand, all right, is this structurally sound? What are some of the other ways I can approach this problem? And so there's definitely different ways to skin that cat, but for the most part, I'm still pretty primarily digital.
Yeah, that's great. So it's good to know that some things can't all be done digitally. Sometimes you've got to get those physical bricks out.
Yeah, you got to get them out to really kind of think outside the box, I've noticed, with some of these designs.
So another great part of this build you mentioned earlier is this Century series down here. If you want to take us through a few more of the details on some of these models.
Yeah, so these were really fun to design because, as you can see, they're all drastically different designs. And so that's what kind of made this build fun, is it's not just like a World War II airplane where they're all generally similar. Every single one of these are almost entirely unique, with the exception of the F-102 and 106, which are both Delta wing aircraft. So like with the F-100, it was trying to figure out the slant wing, swept wing design, as well as the intake in the front. How am I going to represent that intake? With the F-101, it's the very unique style of the wings, the T-tail stabilizer on the vertical stab. And then that just continues down of just all these different challenges that each one of these aircraft presented me. And each one was different, like I said, whether it's the wings, the horizontal stabilizer, the F-104, I had to have those wings angled downward because that's a very unique feature with it. And so, yeah, each one helped me find new techniques to tackle the problem. And that's what I loved about designing them, besides the fact they're really cool aircraft in general.
What types of pieces have you found with all of these different builds you've done now that work well for airplane and aircraft building, and maybe someone else who's interested in doing these types of builds, any tips you would have for them?
So in this scale in particular, I started out in 2x2 bricks, but I've found what more accurately represents that is a single stud spine. So I find myself using a lot of stud bricks to build my designs. And so the one that I'm always running out of is this 1x2 snot brick with studs on either side. And those basically are the backbone to every single one of these one of these Century Series aircraft. It's going to be the backbone when I rebuild a lot of these World War II aircraft. And so snot bricks are everything with this scale.
That's good to know. I think that's definitely a pro tip with not just this build, a lot of Lego builds. When you start getting those snot bricks, it opens up a whole realm of possibilities.
Yeah, it's like just discovering this whole new world. It's like, oh, instead of just going very basic kindergarten level, just fat bricks, it gives me a new dimension. It gives me new ways to work the problem. Instead of just having these blocky builds, I can now have these angles. I can have these slopes and still produce a authentic looking aircraft.
So how do you choose which aircraft you're going to build then, and what plans do you have for the future in terms of more projects you're going to tackle?
So it started out with aircraft that I was flying at the time. So I started out building them when I was in pilot training. And so I built pilot trained aircraft first. And then it went into other aircraft that I had interest in. So naval aviation came up. Then naturally I had to have adversaries. So I built the Japanese. And then I got into Army Air Forces. And then from there I felt like I was kind of getting the skill level to tackle what I really wanted to tackle, which was the KC-135. And then once I built that, it's like a rabbit hole. It's like, now I got to build all the UTAR Guard aircraft. And so it really is just based off my personal interests at the time. Some of the things I want to build more in the future is I want to build more X-planes. I have 4 built now, but I want to kind of build all the rest of these other just famous record-breaking aircraft. Right now I have the X-1, the X-1A, the X-15, and the F-104, which NASA, NACA, and other Air Force entities used to break these records and experiment. But there's this whole lineup of other aircraft that can be built. And there's this famous picture of all the X-planes together. And it's kind of like the Century series. Each one is going to definitely produce a different challenge for me to tackle and figure out how on earth am I going to build this thing in this scale. And whether or not I make it is another story, but I'm going to try. So that's probably going to be next. And I know the X1 ended up getting purchased by Brickmania, and they produced it. And I know a lot of people were asking about having a B-29 carrier ship. So I may design that in the future just out of principles, because what's the X1 without having her mothership dropping her out? And so I think that would be a fun diorama as well, as B-29 and then the X1 dropping out underneath right before it fires off its rocket. So I think that would be fun.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so glad you're continuing to push yourself to improve the builds and do more of these types of builds. Keep up the great work. Thank you.
Appreciate it.